Pastor Michael had always been an early riser, but that November morning something felt different. He woke up at 4 in the morning with an unexplainable heaviness in his chest. His wife was still sleeping peacefully beside him, and the house was quiet except for the old heater clicking on and off. He tried to go back to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By 5:30, he gave up trying to sleep and decided to head to the church. Maybe he'd use the quiet morning hours to prepare for Sunday's sermon. The drive through the empty streets of Millbrook took less than 10 minutes. Their little town had barely changed in the past 50 years. The same diner on Main Street, the same old theater that only showed movies on weekends, the same houses with their warm porch lights. But as he turned onto Church Street, his world stopped. Orange flames were shooting through the roof of Grace Community Church. Thick black smoke poured into the dark sky, and even from a block away he could hear the awful sound of wood cracking and glass shattering. His hands shook so badly he almost couldn't dial his phone. The fire department operator's calm voice felt surreal as Michael stammered out the address, even though sirens were already wailing in the distance. He parked his car in the middle of the street and ran toward the building. The heat hit him like a physical wall, forcing him back. 2 firefighters grabbed him before he could get any closer. "Sir, you need to stay back. The building's not safe," one of them shouted over the roar of the fire. Michael could only stand there, watching 80 years of history burn. That building wasn't just wood and brick to him. It was where his grandmother had been baptized in 1945, where his parents had gotten married, where he'd given his first sermon 20 years ago, nervous and stumbling over his words, where old Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the same pew every Sunday, 3rd row on the left, always arriving exactly 15 minutes early. More fire trucks arrived. Firefighters ran in organized chaos, unrolling hoses and shouting instructions. Water poured onto the flames, but it seemed like trying to stop an ocean with a bucket. The church was old, built entirely of wood back when Millbrook was just a farming community. It burned fast. By 6 in the morning, half the town had gathered behind the yellow tape the police had stretched across the street. Michael saw faces he'd known his entire life, many of them crying openly. Tom Chen, who ran the hardware store, stood with his arm around his wife. The Kowalski family, all 7 of them, huddled together in their pajamas and coats thrown on in a hurry. Betty Williams, 82 years old, leaned on her walker and wept. She'd taught Sunday school in that church for over 40 years. Michael's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Every member of the congregation who wasn't already there was calling, their voices panicked and heartbroken. "Is it true? Please tell me it's not true." He lost count of how many times he had to say yes, it was true. The church was gone. The sun came up around 7, revealing the full extent of the damage. What the fire hadn't destroyed, the water had ruined. The beautiful wooden cross that had hung above the altar for decades lay in pieces. The piano where Mrs. Henderson had played hymns every Sunday was nothing but a twisted metal frame. The old wooden pews that had seated 5 generations of families were reduced to ash and charcoal. Fire investigators arrived and began their work. Michael overheard them talking about electrical problems, something about old wiring that should have been replaced years ago. The church had been meaning to update the electrical system. There just never seemed to be enough money, and it always got pushed to next year's budget. By noon, the investigators confirmed what everyone already knew. The church was a total loss. The walls that were still standing would have to be torn down because they weren't structurally sound. "Insurance?" Michael almost laughed when they asked. The church had basic coverage, but nothing close to what it would cost to rebuild. They were a small congregation, mostly elderly folks living on fixed incomes. Their weekly collections barely covered the pastor's modest salary and basic utilities. That afternoon, Michael called an emergency meeting at the community center. Nearly every member of the congregation showed up. They sat in metal folding chairs in a room that smelled like stale coffee and floor cleaner, so different from their beloved church with its wooden pews and the faint scent of candle wax and old hymnals. Michael stood in front of them, these people he loved like family, and didn't know what to say. How do you comfort people who just lost their spiritual home? Betty Williams raised her hand, her voice shaking. "Pastor, I got married in that church 60 years ago. My parents are buried in the cemetery out back. Where are we going to worship now?" Others joined in. "What about the Christmas service? We've had Christmas Eve service there since 1943. My grandchildren were supposed to be baptized next month." That church survived the flood of 78 and the tornado in 92. How could this happen? An older man named Frank stood up. He was usually quiet, rarely spoke at meetings. Maybe this is a sign, he said. Our congregation's been shrinking for years. Most of us are old. My own kids moved away and never come to church anymore. Maybe it's time to admit that Grace Community Church had a good run, but it's over. The silence that followed was crushing. Michael looked around the room and saw defeat in every face. These weren't just elderly people giving up on a building. These were people giving up on hope itself. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? Frank wasn't wrong. Their congregation had been declining for years. They could barely afford basic maintenance when they had a building. How could they possibly afford to rebuild? The meeting ended with no decisions made and no plans for the future. People shuffled out slowly, many of them crying. Michael stood by the door, shaking hands and hugging people, offering comfort he didn't feel himself. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with his wife, staring at a blank piece of paper where he was supposed to be planning their next steps. Maybe Frank's right, he finally said. Maybe this is just the end. His wife took his hand. You don't believe that? I don't know what I believe anymore, he admitted. The paper stayed blank. Outside, the night was quiet and cold. Somewhere across town, the ruins of Grace Community Church sat dark and silent, still smelling of smoke, and Michael wondered if they'd ever see those walls rise again. 3 days after the fire, Michael was sitting in his home office trying to write thank you notes to the dozen or so people who'd dropped off casseroles and words of sympathy. His desk was covered with cards from other churches in the region, all expressing their condolences but offering little practical help. A few had sent small checks, $20 here, $50 there. It was kind, but it wouldn't rebuild a church. The doorbell rang just after lunch. Michael wasn't expecting anyone and considered not answering. He was tired of well-meaning visitors who didn't know what to say, who stood awkwardly in his doorway searching for comforting words that didn't exist. But he answered anyway. On his front porch stood a man he'd seen around town but never actually spoken to. Rabbi David from the synagogue across town. They'd maybe nodded to each other at the grocery store a handful of times over the years. Pastor Michael, I'm David Stein, from Temple Beth Shalom. The rabbi extended his hand. I'm sorry to bother you at home. Do you have a minute? Michael invited him in, curious and slightly confused. The two men sat in the living room, and for a moment neither spoke. The rabbi seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I saw what happened to your church, David finally said. The whole town saw it. It's a terrible loss. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Our congregation took up a collection. We wanted to help. Michael opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. He stared at it, sure he was reading the number wrong. $5,000. From a synagogue. For a church. He looked up at the rabbi, speechless. David smiled gently. I know what you're thinking. Why would a Jewish congregation donate to rebuild a Christian church? But here's what I believe, Pastor. A house of worship is sacred. Period. It doesn't matter what name we call God or how we pray. When a place where people gather to seek something bigger than themselves burns down, we all feel that loss. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous. There's no need to say anything. Just promise me something. David leaned forward. When you rebuild, and you will rebuild, don't forget this moment. Don't forget that walls and denominations don't matter as much as we think they do. After the rabbi left, Michael sat holding that check for a long time. $5,000 wouldn't rebuild the church, but it was something. More than that, it was hope. The next day, something even more surprising happened. Michael received a phone call from Imam Hassan at the Islamic Center. They'd never spoken before either, though the Islamic Center was only 2 miles from where the church had stood. Pastor Michael, I heard about your church. I'm very sorry for your loss, Hassan said. His voice was warm and sincere. I'm calling because our community wants to help with the rebuilding. We're organizing a workday. We have several contractors and construction workers in our congregation. They're willing to donate their labor when you're ready to rebuild. Michael almost dropped the phone. You're offering to help us rebuild? Of course. Why wouldn't we? You're our neighbors. Your congregation is part of our community. Hassan paused. Can I tell you something? My father's mosque burned down when I was a boy. It was in another state, another lifetime ago. A Christian church in that town organized the rebuilding effort. My father never forgot their kindness. He always said that fire revealed something beautiful, that tragedy showed him the best of humanity. I'd like to do the same for you. Word spread through Millbrook faster than the fire had spread through the church. Within a week, representatives from the Buddhist Meditation Center had visited. They couldn't offer much money, they explained, but they could offer food for volunteers when the rebuilding started. The meditation center ran a small vegetarian restaurant, and they'd be happy to provide meals. Then came the surprise that shocked everyone. The Patel family, who owned the biggest construction supply company in the county, stopped by. They were Hindu, and while they'd never attended Grace Community Church, they'd lived in Millbrook for 15 years. "We heard what everyone's doing," Mr. Patel explained. "We want to be part of it. We'll provide materials at cost. No markup, no profit for us. And anything we can donate outright, we will." Mrs. Patel added, "Our faith teaches us that serving others is serving God. When we heard what the rabbi and the imam were doing, we knew we had to help too." Michael started keeping a list because he couldn't keep track of everyone who wanted to help. The Sikh Gurdwara organized a fundraising dinner and donated $3,000. A group that called themselves the Secular Community Alliance, people who didn't belong to any faith tradition, reached out offering to help with administrative work and fundraising. Even the small Quaker meeting house, which had only about 15 members, sent a donation. The story caught the attention of the local newspaper. Then the regional news picked it up. Then it went viral on social media. Suddenly, Millbrook was getting attention from all over the country. Donations started arriving from strangers in other states. Small amounts mostly, $10 or $20, but they added up. More importantly, the story inspired other communities. Michael received emails from pastors in other towns asking how it happened. How did an interfaith coalition come together so quickly? He didn't have a good answer. It just happened organically, one act of kindness building on another. But not everyone in his congregation was happy about it. Betty Williams, who'd been so heartbroken the day of the fire, came to see Michael with concerns. "Pastor, I'm grateful for the help, I truly am. But I'm worried. If all these other people help rebuild our church, will it still be our church? Will we owe them something?" Others echoed her concerns. Frank, who'd suggested maybe the church's time was over, now worried that accepting help from other faiths was somehow compromising their Christian identity. "We should be rebuilding this ourselves," he argued at a meeting. "Taking money from a synagogue, from a mosque? What would our founding members think?" Michael listened to all of it. He understood the fear. Change is scary, even when it comes wrapped in kindness. These people had lost their spiritual home, and now they were being asked to trust strangers to help rebuild it. That took faith of a different kind, but he also saw something else. He saw younger members of the congregation, people who'd stopped coming regularly, suddenly getting involved again. He saw teenagers volunteering to help with fundraising. He saw the way this tragedy was bringing new life to their community. One evening, Michael gathered the core group of congregation members at his house. About 20 people squeezed into his living room, the same people who'd kept Grace Community Church running for decades. "I know some of you are uncomfortable with all this outside help," Michael began. "I understand. But let me tell you what I've learned these past few weeks. I've learned that kindness doesn't have a religion. Compassion doesn't require the same prayers. The rabbi who brought us that first donation, he didn't do it because he wants something from us. He did it because he believes houses of worship matter. The imam who offered construction help, he's doing it because someone did the same for his father years ago. These people aren't trying to take anything from us. They're trying to give." Betty spoke up, her voice soft. "But what do we give back, Pastor? We're just a small congregation. We can't repay this kind of generosity." "We don't repay it," Michael said. "We pay it forward. We let this change us. We become the kind of church that reaches out to others the way others reached out to us." The room fell quiet. People were thinking, considering. Finally, Tom from the hardware store spoke. "My grandfather helped build that church back in 1943. He always said it was the town's church, not just the congregation's church. Maybe he was right. Maybe it always belonged to the whole community. And we just forgot that for a while." Others nodded slowly. The resistance wasn't gone, but it was softening. People were beginning to see possibility, where before they'd only seen loss. By the end of that meeting, they'd made a decision. They would accept the help being offered. They would welcome this interfaith coalition. And they would rebuild Grace Community Church, not as a monument to what was, but as a symbol of what could be. Michael went to bed that night feeling something he hadn't felt since before the fire. He felt hope. Real solid hope, not because they had enough money yet. Not because they had a plan, but because he'd witnessed something extraordinary. He'd seen barriers dissolve. He'd seen strangers become partners. He'd seen his small town, which had always kept its different communities politely separate, begin to weave itself into something stronger. The church was gone, burned to ash and memory. But something new was being born from those ashes, something that might be even more beautiful than what they'd lost. The groundbreaking was scheduled for the first Saturday in March, exactly 4 months after the fire. Michael woke up that morning to perfect weather, clear skies, and warm sunshine that felt like a blessing. His wife made him eat breakfast even though his stomach was doing nervous flips. What if nobody showed up? What if the interfaith coalition that had seemed so strong in planning meetings fell apart when it came time for actual work? He needn't have worried. By 8 in the morning, the empty lot where Grace Community Church once stood was filled with people. Not just 20 or 30 volunteers, but over 200. They kept coming, parking along every street in the neighborhood, walking up in groups, carrying tool belts and work gloves and coolers full of drinks. Michael stood at the edge of the property, trying to take it all in. There was Rabbi David, wearing jeans and a work shirt, helping to unload lumber from a truck. Imam Hassan was organizing volunteers into work crews, his voice carrying across the lot with easy authority. The Patel family had arrived with not 1 but 3 trucks full of supplies. Members of the Buddhist Center were setting up tables for lunch. The Sikh community had brought a massive tent for shade, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, people who'd never spoken to each other before were introducing themselves, shaking hands, laughing together. Betty Williams grabbed Michael's arm. She was crying, but this time they were happy tears. "Pastor, look at this. Just look at this. I've lived in this town for 60 years and I've never seen anything like it." The groundbreaking ceremony itself was unlike anything Millbrook had ever witnessed. They'd planned it carefully, making sure every community felt represented. Rabbi David offered a Jewish blessing in Hebrew, then translated it. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, who has given us life, sustained us, and brought us to this moment." Imam Hassan followed with a Muslim prayer. "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, we ask for blessings on this work and on all who gather here in peace and fellowship." A Buddhist monk named Thiksh offered words about compassion and interconnection. A Hindu priest spoke about the divine spark that exists in all creation. A Quaker woman named Ruth spoke about the inner light and working with open hearts. Even the Secular Community Alliance representative, a teacher named Mrs. Rodriguez, offered words about human kindness and community strength. When it was Michael's turn, he looked out at the crowd and had to pause to collect himself. "Jesus taught us to love our neighbors," he finally said. "He never said those neighbors had to look like us, pray like us, or believe like us. He just said love them. Today, you're all teaching me what that really means. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for caring. Thank you for proving that what unites us is stronger than what divides us." Then they broke ground. Literally. 5 shovels, held by representatives from different faiths, all digging into the earth together. The crowd cheered. Someone had brought a camera and was taking pictures. A local news crew filmed the whole thing, and then the real work began. The scene that unfolded over the next few hours was something Michael would remember for the rest of his life. Teenagers from the mosque worked alongside elderly church members, measuring and marking where the foundation would go. A Jewish construction foreman named Jacob directed a crew of volunteers that included Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and atheists, all following his instructions without hesitation. 2 women stood side by side hauling materials. One wore a hijab, the other a cross necklace. They were talking about their kids, laughing about parent-teacher conferences and soccer practice, finding common ground in the universal experience of raising children. Tom, from the hardware store, found himself working next to a Sikh man named Raj. They'd probably passed each other on the street 100 times and never exchanged more than a polite nod. Now they were discussing the best type of wood for the window frames, debating construction techniques, and by lunchtime, they were swapping stories about their families. The Buddhist Center had prepared an incredible vegetarian feast. Tables were set up under the tent, and when the lunch bell rang, everyone gathered together. It wasn't segregated by faith or background. People sat wherever there was space, mixing naturally, continuing conversations that had started during the morning's work. Michael watched a fascinating scene unfold. Frank, who'd been so resistant to accepting outside help, sat between Imam Hassan and Mr. Patel, all three of them deep in conversation about building codes and permit requirements. Frank was smiling, something Michael hadn't seen him do in months. Betty Williams was teaching a group of younger volunteers about the church's history, pointing to old photographs they'd salvaged from the fire. A Muslim teenager, a Hindu college student, and a Jewish woman in her 30s listened intently, asking questions, genuinely interested in the stories of this church that wasn't theirs but somehow was becoming theirs through this shared effort. The children present, and there were quite a few, played together without any awareness of religious differences. They were just kids being kids, running around, laughing, getting in the way of the adults in that cheerful way children do. Michael saw his vision of the future in those children. They wouldn't grow up with the same walls and divisions their parents had known. They'd remember this day, remember working together, remember that differences didn't have to mean distance. As the afternoon wore on, the work continued. The March sun grew warmer and people shed their jackets. Someone brought out a radio, and music played softly in the background. Not religious music, just popular songs everyone knew. People sang along while they worked, voices mixing together. A group of women organized a water station, making sure everyone stayed hydrated. They represented at least 5 different faith traditions, but you'd never know it from watching them work together. They joked and laughed and complained about their husbands with the universal camaraderie of women who'd found unexpected friendship. The construction progress was remarkable. With so many skilled volunteers, they accomplished more in one day than Michael had dared hope. The foundation was marked and prepared. Materials were organized and ready. A timeline was established. Rabbi David's son, who was a project manager, had created a detailed schedule that would allow different volunteer groups to work on different days, maximizing the help available while keeping the site safe and organized. As the sun started to set, people began to pack up their tools. But nobody seemed to want to leave. Small groups stood around talking, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet again. The work crews had become friendships. The strangers had become neighbors in the truest sense of the word. Michael stood with the other faith leaders, watching the scene. "This is bigger than any of us realized," Rabbi David said quietly. "We thought we were just rebuilding a church. But we're rebuilding something more important. Community," Imam Hassan finished. "Real community. The kind that doesn't see boundaries." The mayor showed up just as people were leaving. She'd been in the state capitol at a conference and had rushed back when she heard how many people had shown up. She stood on a makeshift platform and addressed the volunteers who remained. "I've been mayor of this town for 12 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I knew Millbrook. I thought I understood what we were. But today, you showed me we're so much more than I realized. This isn't just about a church anymore. This is about all of us remembering what it means to be a community, to be neighbors, to be human beings who care about each other. I'm proud of this town in a way I've never been before." The crowd applauded. People hugged. More tears were shed, but they were good tears. Hopeful tears. As Michael drove home that night, his muscles aching from physical labor he wasn't used to, he thought about how wrong he'd been the night of the fire. He'd thought losing the church meant losing everything. He'd seen only endings and couldn't imagine new beginnings, but today had shown him something profound. The old church was gone, yes, but it had been replaced by something no fire could ever destroy. It had been replaced by connection, by friendship, by people of different faiths and backgrounds choosing to work together toward a common goal. The wooden building that had stood for 80 years was ash now. But the spirit of what a church should be, what any house of worship should be, was more alive than ever. It existed not in walls and roofs, but in the hands that had worked together today. In the conversations and laughter. In the teenagers who'd served food side by side. In Frank and Imam Hassan discussing construction plans. In Betty Williams sharing her stories with people who'd never heard them before. Michael pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. His wife appeared at the front door, silhouetted by the light from inside, waiting for him. He'd have so much to tell her, about the hundreds of people who'd shown up, about the walls that had come down between communities, about how hope looked like 200 people with hammers and shovels and open hearts. Tomorrow they'd start again, and the day after that, and the day after that, week after week, different groups would come to work, to build, to be together. The church would rise again. But more importantly, something else was rising too. Something that Millbrook had needed for a long time without realizing it. They were becoming one community instead of many separate ones. And that, Michael realized, might be an even greater miracle than any building they could construct. The trouble started small, the way trouble usually does. About 3 weeks after the groundbreaking, Michael started receiving anonymous letters. They arrived in plain white envelopes with no return address, typed messages that got progressively more hostile. The first one was relatively mild. "Pastor Michael, I'm concerned about the direction our church is taking. Are we still a Christian church if non-Christians are building it?" The second letter was sharper. "You're selling out our faith for money and publicity. Our ancestors would be ashamed." By the fourth letter, the writer wasn't even pretending to be polite. "This isn't Grace Community Church anymore. It's a circus. You've turned our sacred space into a political statement." Michael tried to ignore them, tried to tell himself it was just one person with concerns. But deep down, he knew that one person probably represented others who were thinking the same things, but not saying them out loud. Then Frank stopped coming to the planning meetings. Frank, who'd been so involved in the early days, who'd started to come around to the idea of accepting help, suddenly became distant. When Michael called him, Frank was polite but cold. "I just don't think this is right anymore, Pastor. That's all I can say." The real blow came during a regional church conference. Michael attended, hoping to share the good news about the rebuilding and maybe inspire other congregations. Instead, he found himself defending his choices to church leaders from across the state. Pastor Williams from First Baptist, a large church in the next county, cornered him during lunch. "Michael, I've been hearing about your project. I have to tell you, I have serious concerns. You're allowing non-Christians to build a Christian church. How is that appropriate?" "They're helping rebuild our community," Michael explained. "They're not trying to change our beliefs or our practices." Pastor Williams shook his head. "But what message does it send? That all religions are the same? That it doesn't matter what we believe? The Bible is very clear about not being unequally yoked with unbelievers." Other pastors joined the conversation, and Michael found himself surrounded by criticism. They questioned his judgment, his theology, his leadership. One older pastor, someone Michael had respected for years, said, "Sometimes, son, it's better to let a church die with dignity than to compromise everything it stands for." Michael drove home from that conference feeling defeated. Maybe they were right. Maybe he'd gotten caught up in the positive publicity and lost sight of what was important. The construction itself was facing problems too. The early March weather had been perfect, but April brought constant rain. The site turned into a mud pit. Work stopped for days at a time, waiting for the ground to dry. When they could work, they discovered the foundation had issues they hadn't anticipated. The old church's foundation had damaged the ground in ways the initial survey hadn't caught. They'd need to do additional work, which meant additional costs. The budget, which had seemed adequate with all the donations and discounted materials, suddenly wasn't enough. They needed another $15,000. The fundraising had slowed down after the initial viral moment. The story wasn't new anymore. The donations had dried up. Michael called a meeting with the Interfaith Coalition. About 30 people showed up, representatives from all the groups that had been helping. He laid out the problems honestly. The foundation issues, the budget shortfall, the weather delays. "But there's something else," he admitted, his voice heavy. "Some members of my congregation are questioning whether we should even continue. They're uncomfortable with how this has all unfolded, and honestly, I'm getting pressure from other church leaders. They think we're compromising our faith." The room went quiet. Rabbi David spoke first. "Are you saying you want to stop? That you want us to back out?" "I don't know what I'm saying," Michael confessed. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought this was about building bridges and showing that kindness transcends religion. But maybe I was naive. Maybe I didn't think about how this would look, what it would mean." Imam Hassan leaned forward. "Pastor Michael, let me tell you something. When we started helping, we knew some people would object. In my community, there were those who questioned why we should spend time and money on a Christian church. Some said we should focus on our own center, which also needs repairs. But we moved forward because we believed it was right. Now you're saying maybe it wasn't? I'm saying maybe I was wrong to put you all in this position, Michael said. Maybe I was wrong to accept help that would cause this much controversy. Mrs. Patel, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. Her voice was gentle but firm. Pastor, do you know why we helped? It wasn't just kindness. It wasn't charity. It was because we believe that we're all connected. When one house of worship burns, we all lose something. When one community suffers, we all suffer. You didn't put us in any position. We chose to be here. But the money, Michael said. We don't have the money to continue. We'll find it, Rabbi David said simply. We'll do another fundraiser. We'll reach out to more communities. We'll make it work, but what if we can't? What if this whole project fails? All of you have invested so much time and energy and resources. What if it was all for nothing? Tom from the hardware store, who'd been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. Pastor, remember what you told us after the fire? You said that kindness doesn't have a religion. You said compassion doesn't require the same prayers. Were you wrong about that? Michael looked at him, surprised to hear his own words quoted back at him. Tom continued. Because if you were right then, you're still right now. Some people being uncomfortable doesn't change the truth. And the truth is, this town needed this. We needed to learn how to work together. We needed to see each other as neighbors instead of strangers who just happened to live in the same place. Betty Williams, who'd been standing by the door, walked into the room. Michael hadn't even realized she was there. Pastor Michael, I was one of the people who was uncomfortable with all this. I told you that. I was worried about what it meant, whether we were giving up something important. She paused, looking around the room at all the faces. But I was wrong. Do you know what I've learned these past few months? I've learned that my faith isn't threatened by other people's faith. I've learned that working beside someone who prays differently than me doesn't make my prayers less meaningful. If anything, it makes them more meaningful because I understand better what I'm praying for. I'm praying for exactly this, for people to see past their differences, for communities to come together, for love to be bigger than fear. Her voice got stronger. And I'll tell you something else. Those anonymous letters you're getting, I know who's writing them. It's Walter Henderson. And Walter is scared. He's scared of change, scared of losing control, scared that the world he knows is disappearing. But his fear doesn't get to win, Pastor. We don't stop building just because someone's afraid. The room erupted in agreement. People started talking over each other, offering solutions, pledging more support. The mood shifted from uncertain to determined in moments. Raj, the Sikh man who'd become friends with Tom, stood up. At our Gurdwara, we have a principle called sewa. It means selfless service. We give without expecting anything in return. That's what this is. You're not putting us out, Pastor. You're giving us an opportunity to live our values. The Buddhist monk spoke next. In Buddhism, we talk about the interconnection of all beings. Your suffering is our suffering. Your joy is our joy. This church matters to us because you matter to us. It's that simple. One by one, people around the room shared why they were committed to finishing the project. Not because they wanted publicity or recognition, not because they had some ulterior motive, but because it was right. Because community mattered. Because they'd found something in this work that fed their souls in ways they hadn't expected. A young woman from the Secular Community Alliance, a college student named Lisa, raised her hand. Pastor, I don't believe in God. I need you to know that up front. But I believe in people. I believe in community. I believe that what we're doing here is important. Not because it's a church, but because it's proof that people can work together despite their differences. In a world that feels more divided every day, this matters. Please don't give up. Michael felt tears streaming down his face. He'd come to this meeting ready to surrender, ready to tell everyone it was too hard, too complicated, too controversial. Instead, he found himself surrounded by people who believed more strongly than he did that this work mattered. Rabbi David walked over and put his hand on Michael's shoulder. You're tired. You're discouraged. You're facing criticism from people you respect. All of that is real and valid. But here's what's also real. We're in this together. Not just the building, but all of it. The doubts, the setbacks, the criticism. We share it all. I don't want your communities to suffer because you're helping us, Michael said. Let us worry about our communities, Imam Hassan replied. You worry about yours. Help them understand what we already know, that this is bigger than any one church or any one faith. This is about what kind of world we want to live in. The meeting lasted another hour. By the end, they had a plan. They'd launch another fundraising campaign, this time focusing on regional businesses and foundations. Different faith communities would each host their own fundraising events. The Secular Community Alliance would organize a community concert. Everyone would contribute what they could. More than that, they decided to address the criticism directly. They'd hold a community forum where anyone with concerns could voice them. They'd be transparent about every decision, every dollar spent, every plan made. No more anonymous letters. If people had issues, they could raise them publicly and get honest answers. As people filed out, many of them stopped to hug Michael, to offer words of encouragement, to remind him why they'd started this journey. He felt less alone than he had in weeks, but he also knew the hardest part was still ahead. He needed to face his congregation, including the people who were unhappy. He needed to address the criticism from other church leaders. He needed to find a way to hold on to the vision while being honest about the challenges. That night, sitting at his kitchen table with his wife, Michael pulled out the latest anonymous letter. He read it again, trying to see past the anger to the fear underneath. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He wrote a response, not to mail it, but to clarify his own thoughts. "Dear Walter," he wrote, guessing Betty was right about the author, "I understand you're afraid. Change is scary. Opening our doors to people who are different from us feels risky. But here's what I've learned. Faith without risk isn't really faith at all. It's just comfort. And comfort, while nice, doesn't change the world. Love changes the world. And love means taking risks." He finished the letter and read it over. Then he folded it up and put it in his desk drawer. Tomorrow he'd face the congregation. Tomorrow he'd answer the critics. Tomorrow he'd find a way to move forward, but tonight he'd remember that he wasn't alone, that an entire community had shown up to say they believed in this work. That belief, he decided, was enough to carry him through whatever came next. The community forum was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in early May. Michael hardly slept the night before. He kept rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd respond to criticism, how he'd defend the choices they'd made. His wife finally told him at 2 a.m. to stop worrying and trust that the truth would be enough. The forum was held at the high school auditorium because they needed space for everyone who wanted to attend. Michael arrived an hour early and was shocked to find the parking lot already filling up. This wasn't just going to be their small congregation. This was going to be half the town. Inside, volunteers were setting up chairs. The stage had a simple table with microphones. There were no decorations, no fanfare, just a space for honest conversation. People started filing in at 6:30. Michael recognized members of his congregation, some looking supportive, others clearly angry. But there were also people from all the other faith communities. The entire interfaith coalition seemed to be there. And hundreds of other townspeople, including many he didn't recognize at all. By 7 o'clock, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. The fire marshal probably should have stopped letting people in, but he didn't. This was too important. Michael stood at the microphone, his hands shaking slightly. "Thank you all for coming. I know this hasn't been easy for anyone. Tonight is about honesty. If you have concerns, questions, or criticisms, we want to hear them. We want to address them openly." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter Henderson stood up. He was 83 years old, a lifelong member of Grace Community Church, and Michael had suspected for weeks that he was behind the anonymous letters. "Pastor Michael, I'll go first." Walter's voice was steady but emotional. "I've been writing you letters. Anonymous letters. I'm not proud of that, but I did it because I was afraid to say these things publicly. I'm saying them now because Betty Williams came to my house and told me I was being a coward." A few people laughed nervously. Walter continued. "My concern is simple. Grace Community Church has been a Christian church for 80 years. My grandparents helped found it. My parents were married there. I was baptized there. And now we're letting Muslims and Jews and Hindus and people who don't believe in God at all rebuild it. How is that still our church? How are we not giving away everything that made it special?" The room went silent. Michael started to respond, but Rabbi David stood up first. "Mr. Henderson, may I say something?" David asked. Walter nodded, surprised. "I want to tell you a story," David began. "In 1938, my grandfather fled Germany. He was Jewish, and he knew what was coming. He made it to England with just the clothes on his back. He had nothing. No money, no friends, no family. He was alone and terrified." David's voice got quieter and people leaned forward to hear. A Christian church in London took him in. They gave him food, shelter, and helped him find work. They didn't ask him to convert. They didn't preach to him. They just helped because that's what their faith taught them to do. My grandfather never forgot that. He used to say that those Christians showed him what God looks like in action. David looked directly at Walter. When your church burned down, I thought about my grandfather. I thought about how a Christian church once helped a Jewish refugee who had nothing. And I thought, now it's my turn. Now I get to show what my faith teaches me. We're not building a synagogue here. We're helping rebuild a Christian church. We're not trying to change what you believe or take anything from you. We're just trying to be good neighbors. Isn't that what all our faiths teach us? Walter sat down slowly, his eyes wet. Several people were crying now. A woman in her 50s stood up. Michael didn't recognize her. I'm not from Millbrook, she said. I drove here from 2 hours away because I read about this project online. I'm not particularly religious. I don't go to church or synagogue or anywhere like that. But I had to come tonight because what you're doing here gives me hope. Her voice cracked with emotion. I have a daughter. She's 19. Last year she told us she didn't want to talk to us anymore because we voted differently than she did in an election. Over politics, I lost my daughter. We live in a country that feels like it's tearing itself apart over every little difference. And then I read about a town where people who pray to different gods are working together to build something. It made me think maybe we're not completely lost. Maybe there's still hope. She sat down, wiping her eyes. Michael saw people nodding throughout the audience. Frank stood up next. Frank, who'd been so resistant, who'd stopped coming to meetings. I owe some people an apology, he said. I've been against this project from the start. First, I thought we should just give up. Then, when everyone wanted to rebuild, I thought we should do it ourselves. I didn't want outside help, especially from people who weren't Christian. I thought it was wrong. He paused, looking around the room. But I've been watching. I've been watching Muslims work in the rain to pour our foundation. I've been watching Jewish contractors donate their time. I've been watching Hindu families bring food for volunteers. I've been watching Buddhist monks meditate on our site every morning before work begins, asking for blessings on the project. And you know what I realized? I was wrong. These people aren't trying to take anything from us. They're teaching us something we forgot. They're teaching us what it means to love your neighbor. Frank looked at Imam Hassan. I'm sorry. I judged you before I knew you. I was wrong. Hassan stood and walked across the auditorium. He hugged Frank. The room erupted in applause. Betty Williams stood up. I have something to say too. I was worried about this project, just like Walter. But I've changed my mind and I want to tell you why. Last week my granddaughter came to visit. She's 16. She usually spends the whole visit on her phone, barely talking to me. But this time, she wanted to hear about the church rebuilding. She'd seen something about it online, and she said something that stuck with me. She said, Grandma, this is the kind of world I want to live in, where people help each other even when they're different. Betty's voice got stronger. That's when I realized something. We're not just rebuilding a church. We're showing the next generation how to live. We're showing them that differences don't have to divide us. That's a gift. That's worth protecting. One after another, people stood to share. Some expressed concerns that were thoughtfully addressed. Some shared stories of how the project had changed them. A Muslim teenager talked about how working on the church had taught her about Christianity in ways that made her appreciate her own faith more. A Christian man talked about attending a Sikh Gurdwara for the first time and being moved by the experience. Then something unexpected happened. A man in his 40s stood up, looking uncomfortable. My name is Greg. I'm not from here. I live about 40 miles away. I came tonight because I've been following this story and I need to confess something. The room got very quiet. Greg's hands were shaking. 15 years ago, I burned down a mosque. Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Imam Hassan sat up straighter. Greg continued, tears streaming down his face. I was young and stupid and full of hate. I believed all the propaganda about Muslims. I thought I was protecting my community. I went to prison for it, served 8 years. When I got out, I was lost. I didn't know how to move forward. How to live with what I'd done. He looked directly at Imam Hassan. I've been watching what you're doing here. Watching you help rebuild a Christian church. And it's destroying me, in a good way. Because it's showing me what I should have been all along. It's showing me that faith should bring people together, not tear them apart. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to come here and say this. What you're all doing matters. It matters more than you know. Hassan stood and walked toward Greg. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Hassan embraced him. You were lost, Hassan said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent auditorium. Now you're found. That's what matters. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Michael realized he was witnessing something sacred, something that transcended any building they could construct. The forum lasted 3 hours. By the end, the opposition had mostly melted away. People who'd come with concerns left with understanding. The few who remained uncomfortable at least understood why others felt differently. The next morning, Michael received a call from Mrs. Patel. Pastor, you need to see this. She sent him a link to a crowdfunding campaign that had started overnight. Someone who'd been at the forum had set it up. It had already raised $12,000 and donations were coming in from around the country. The fundraising goal would be met within a week, but more than the money, something else had shifted. The project had become something bigger than any of them had imagined. Media from around the world wanted to cover the story. Religious leaders from other cities reached out, asking how they could replicate this model. Universities wanted to study it as an example of interfaith cooperation. The construction moved forward through May and June. Different volunteer groups rotated through. Workdays became community events. People brought their kids. Friendships deepened. The walls went up, the roof went on, and slowly but surely a building took shape. But it wasn't the same building that had stood there before. It couldn't be. Too much had changed. The new church incorporated design elements from the various communities that had helped build it. A stained glass window created by Muslim artisans depicted images of light and unity. Wooden beams carved by Jewish craftsmen bore traditional symbols of peace. Hindu volunteers had designed a garden area that would serve as a quiet meditation space. Buddhist monks had helped plan the layout to optimize natural light and peaceful energy flow. Some traditional church members worried these elements made it less of a church, but Michael helped them see differently. Every element tells a story, he explained. The story of people coming together. The story of love overcoming fear. That's the most Christian message possible. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for October, exactly 1 year after the fire. As the date approached, Michael found himself reflecting on how much had changed. Not just the building, but the town, but most of all himself.